She was 19 years old, sold by her own father to pay a gambling debt, handed over to a mountain man so feared that grown men crossed the street to avoid his shadow. The town of Black Hollow watched her leave like they were watching a lamb walk into wolf country. Some laughed, some shook their heads. None of them expected to ever see her standing again. They were wrong. This is the story of Evelyn Mercer, the girl who was traded like property, and the mountain that turned her into something nobody could ever buy, sell, or break again. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. Now stay with me until the very end. You won't regret it. The morning Evelyn Mercer was handed over, the sky above Black Hollow sat low and gray, the kind of sky that pressed down on a person's chest like a boot heel grinding dirt. She stood in front of Callum Mercer's house. She refused to call it home anymore, hadn't called it home in years, with a burlap sack thrown over one shoulder and absolutely nothing else to her name. The sack held 2 changes of clothes, a tin cup with a dented rim, a short-handled knife she'd stolen from the kitchen drawer that morning before her father woke up, and a small strip of leather she used to tie back her hair. That was it. That was the entire material sum of 19 years of living. Callum stood on the porch above her, still wearing yesterday's shirt, which smelled like whiskey and poor decisions. His eyes were bloodshot. His hands shook the way they always did in the mornings before his first drink found him. He wasn't looking at Evelyn. He was looking somewhere past her, toward the road, because Callum Mercer had never been a man who could hold eye contact with the things he'd done. "It's a fair arrangement," he said to the air in front of him. He needed a woman for the household. I needed the debt cleared. Nobody's being hurt here. Evelyn didn't answer. She had stopped answering her father a long time ago, back around the time she figured out that the words coming out of his mouth were less about truth and more about the story he needed to tell himself to keep sleeping at night. She adjusted the sack on her shoulder and looked down the road instead. Rowan Vale was already there. She had heard stories about Rowan Vale the way children hear stories about avalanches, as something large, distant, and theoretically capable of destroying everything in its path. He was a trapper and a hunter who worked the Bitterroot Mountains north of Black Hollow, coming into town maybe 3 or 4 times a year to trade pelts and buy supplies, and mostly to remind people that the wilderness was real and that it produced men of a particular kind that the comfortable side of civilization rarely understood. He was enormous. That was the first thing. Not just tall. Evelyn had met tall men, but built the way old-growth timber is built, with a density that suggested the weight of years layered on top of years. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders that blocked the light behind him, and hands the size of small shovels. His face was heavily bearded, mostly brown going gray at the edges, and his eyes were a flat, pale gray that reminded Evelyn of ice over a deep lake, the kind you couldn't see the bottom of. He was standing beside a wagon hitched to 2 draft horses. He wasn't fidgeting, he wasn't looking around or checking the time or doing any of the small anxious things people did when they were waiting. He was simply standing there, the way a tree stands, like waiting was just another thing that happened to him, and he had no particular feelings about it either way. When Evelyn walked toward him, he watched her approach without expression. "You're the girl," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Evelyn," she said. "Mercer. Though I suppose the Mercer part is negotiable at this point." Something passed across his face. Not quite amusement, something adjacent to it. "Can you cook?" he asked. "Well enough? Can you work?" "Better than most." He studied her for a moment, eyes moving from her face to her hands to her boots. It wasn't a leer. There was nothing like that in it. It was assessment. The same look she'd seen hunters give horses they were considering buying. "The children are difficult," he said finally. "So am I," Evelyn said. Another one of those almost expressions crossed his face. Then he turned, climbed up onto the wagon seat and said, "Get in then," the way a person might say it to a dog they weren't sure about but had decided to bring along anyway. Evelyn climbed into the back of the wagon. She didn't look at her father. She didn't look back at the house. She looked forward at the road, at the place where Black Hollow ended and the mountains began. And she told herself she was going to be fine. She was not entirely sure she believed it. The people of Black Hollow had collected themselves along the main street to watch her go, because small towns ran on spectacle the way other things ran on fuel. They stood in clusters of 2 and 3 outside the general store, in front of the blacksmiths leaning on fence posts, and they watched the wagon roll past with the particular expressions of people who have front row seats to something they expect to go badly. Evelyn kept her eyes straight ahead. She heard things, though. She couldn't help that. Poor thing won't last a week. Callum ought to be ashamed, trading his own blood like she was livestock. Rowan Vale's children are half wild, they say, raised in the mountains with no proper schooling. That girl's gonna freeze up there. Or run. Either way. She heard all of it. She filed it away in the part of herself that kept score, the part that had been quietly keeping score for 19 years, tallying every humiliation and every dismissal and every small cruelty, building something out of it, something that wasn't quite bitterness, but was close enough to it that it burned with a similar heat. The wagon lurched and bumped over the rutted road. The town fell behind her. Rowan Vale said nothing the entire way up the mountain. Bye. The Bitterroot Mountains were not beautiful in the way that paintings made mountains look beautiful. Up close, they were brutal and indifferent. All jagged rock faces and dense black timber and narrow paths that had been cut by animals in water rather than by any human hand that thought about your comfort. The air thinned as the wagon climbed. The temperature dropped in increments that Evelyn felt first in her ears, then in her fingers, then in her chest. Rowan navigated the path without seeming to pay attention to it, the reins loose in his hands, his body absorbing the jostling of the wagon without complaint. He knew this road the way people knew their own skin. After almost 2 hours of climbing, a cabin came into view through a break in the trees. Evelyn's stomach dropped. She had not been expecting luxury. She had genuinely not expected anything that resembled luxury, but she had perhaps, somewhere in a place she hadn't examined too closely, held on to a small hope that the living situation would be survivable. That was the word she'd been using internally. Survivable. The cabin was survivable in the same way that a very bad illness was survivable. Technically possible, but deeply unpleasant and requiring a great deal of effort. The structure itself was solid enough. The logs were thick and the roof looked like it held. But the yard was a wreck of split wood and rusted tools and things that had been left wherever they'd been dropped, apparently permanently. The windows were so thick with grime that they'd stopped being windows in any functional sense. The front step had rotted through on one side. A pile of hides that had clearly been there for a while was stacked against the south wall, stiff and dark. And there were the children. They came out of the cabin door like something that had been waiting behind it, which was exactly what they'd been doing. They arranged themselves in the yard in a rough line, and Evelyn counted quickly. 5. 5 children ranging in age from what looked like about 6 to maybe 16 or 17. The eldest was a boy who carried his height and his bone structure straight from his father, with the same flat gray eyes and the same quality of absolute stillness, except that where Rowan's stillness seemed like patience, this boy's stillness seemed like something coiled. He held a hunting rifle with his right hand, not pointed at anything, just held, the way some people hold a grudge, constantly and without thinking about it. He watched Evelyn climb down from the wagon with an expression she could only describe as deliberately unimpressed. Behind him stood a girl of about 14, dark-haired and thin, with sharp eyes that took in everything and gave nothing back. Then 2 boys who looked close in age, maybe 10 and 12, who were elbowing each other and whispering and trying to look like they weren't doing either. And last, half hidden behind her oldest brother's arm, a girl who couldn't have been more than 6, with her hair in 2 rough braids and her thumb in her mouth and her eyes enormous and dark. Rowan climbed down from the wagon and said flatly, "This is Evelyn. She's running the household now." The eldest boy's jaw tightened. The 14-year-old crossed her arms. The middle boys went still. The little one tucked herself further behind her brother. Nobody said hello. "I'm your father's wife?" Evelyn asked quietly, keeping her voice level. "No," Rowan said. He said it quickly, in a way that seemed important to him. "You're the housekeeper. That's the arrangement." "All right." She looked at the children. "What are your names?" Silence. "His name is Cade," the 14-year-old finally said, nodding at the eldest with an expression that suggested she'd decided to answer mostly out of contempt for the exercise. "I'm Ada. Those 2 are William and George. And the little one is Maisie." Good, Evelyn said. Thank you, Ada. Ada looked at her like she'd said something offensive and went back inside. The inside of the cabin was, if possible, worse than the outside. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a moment, taking stock with the focused, clinical attention of someone who has survived difficult things by being honest about how difficult they are rather than pretending otherwise. There was a fireplace on the far wall, and the fire in it had burned down to a few sullen red coals that were putting out more smoke than heat. The main room held a rough table, several chairs of varying structural integrity, a collection of pots and pans that hadn't been properly cleaned in what smelled like several weeks, and a general layer of grime over every horizontal surface. The smell was particular. Wood smoke and animal fat and unwashed wool and the sour note underneath all of it that comes from a place where people have been living too close together without enough warmth or ventilation or anyone cleaning anything. In the corner nearest the fireplace, a pile of pine needles and old blankets that served as a sleeping area for what Evelyn gathered was the youngest girl had clearly not been changed in some time. Rowan came in behind her, carrying her sack. "It needs work," he said without particular apology. "It needs a fire first," Evelyn said. "Where's the wood?" He pointed at the pile outside. She set down her sack, crossed the room, and picked up the iron poker from beside the fireplace. She spent a few minutes coaxing the coals back into something that could be called a fire, adding the scraps of wood from the small pile inside the cabin. Then she straightened up and looked at the room again. "William," she said. "George." The two middle boys, who had been watching from the far side of the room with the barely concealed fascination of people watching something they expected to explode, went rigid. "Yes?" one of them said. "I need wood from outside, a full armload each. Then I need every pot in this room brought to the table so I can see what we're working with." They looked at each other. "Da didn't say we had to," the other one started. "Your father's the one who told me to run the household," Evelyn said pleasantly. "So, wood. Now, please." Another mutual glance. Then, with the slightly stunned expressions of people who've been told to do something reasonable in a tone that allowed no room for argument, they went outside. Rowan watched all of this from the doorway. He said nothing. Cade Vale was 16 years old, and he had decided before the wagon ever appeared on the road below that he hated this woman and everything she represented, and that the decision had already been made and was not subject to revision based on additional information. This was not, on the surface, an irrational position for a 16-year-old boy who had spent the last 14 months watching his younger siblings grieve and watching his father move through the world like a man carrying something too heavy in the wrong place, and who had stepped into the gap as best a 16-year-old could, step into a gap that no 16-year-old should have to fill. He had been the one who'd kept Maisie from screaming herself into exhaustion at night by sitting beside her and telling her stories he half remembered and half invented. He had been the one who'd taken George and William out hunting when Rowan was away and taught them to read tracks and gut a rabbit and start a fire in wet conditions. He had been the one who'd held Ada while she cried and told her it was okay, and privately wondered when it was going to stop being okay. He had done all of this without complaint because he was his father's son, and his father did not complain. And now this woman had arrived with her burlap sack and her flat, assessing eyes, and his father had told her she was running the household, and Cade had decided that was unacceptable in a way that went somewhere below words, somewhere down into the chest where real feelings live and never quite surface cleanly. He watched her from across the room for the rest of the afternoon, cataloging her movements, looking for the weakness that would eventually show itself. She'd grabbed the poker with confidence, but she'd hesitated when she looked at the pots. They were in worse shape than she'd expected. He'd seen the brief flicker of it in her face. She gave orders to William and George like she had practiced giving orders, but her voice had gone slightly tighter when Ada hadn't answered her directly. She was adapting, he observed sourly, faster than he'd have liked. That night, she made dinner from what was in the cabin, which was cornmeal, dried beans, a bit of salt pork, and some dried herbs that had been hanging from the ceiling for so long he'd stopped seeing them. The meal she produced from these materials was edible in a way that the meals they'd been producing for themselves recently had struggled to be. He ate it without acknowledging it. The next morning, she was up before any of them, the fire already rebuilt, water already heating. He He came out to find her scrubbing the table with a brush she'd apparently fashioned from pine needles tied around a stick, because there was no proper brush in the cabin. He stood in the doorway to the back room and watched her. She didn't look up. "I know you're there," she said. "Good for you," he said. "You can either grab that other pot and start scrubbing, or you can stand there. Either way, the table's getting clean." He stood there. She scrubbed. The first week was a battle waged mostly in silence and small acts of sabotage. Evelyn hauled water from the creek downhill of the cabin every morning, carrying 2 buckets at a time up a slope that turned her arms to fire and her back into one long ache. She scrubbed every surface. She reorganized the food stores, discovering in the process that they were in worse shape than she'd realized. More things molded or mouse-gotten than she'd hoped, which meant the winter calculations she'd been running in her head were going to need revising downward. She mended 2 coats, darned a sock pile that had reached ecological complexity, and rewrote the pile of sleeping materials in the corner into something closer to actual bedding. She also, every day, cooked 3 meals, with what she had, which was not a lot. The children received all of this with varying degrees of hostility. William and George had shifted within 3 days from open resistance to a kind of cautious neutrality, the way children do when they've figured out that the new situation isn't immediately threatening and might in fact occasionally produce warm food without requiring anything too painful in return. Maisie watched Evelyn from a careful distance and hadn't spoken to her directly yet, but had taken to sitting within 10 feet of her while she worked, which Evelyn counted as progress. Ada maintained her posture of cold, precise indifference, communicating through a series of extremely controlled silences that she was not impressed. And Cade made himself into a problem every chance he got. He didn't do it dramatically. Evelyn had to give him that. He wasn't a dramatic boy, or at least he worked hard not to be. The sabotage was quiet. Food left where it would go bad. Water she'd carried uphill somehow tipped over. Wood she'd stacked rearranged so it would fall. Small things. Individually dismissible. Together, a pattern so consistent it could only be intentional. Evelyn said nothing about it. She just did the work again. Rowan Vale left before dawn most mornings and came back after dark most nights. And in between, he existed in the cabin like weather, as something large and present and capable of force, but not currently applying it. He ate the meals she made without comment. He checked the traps he'd set around the property and brought back what they caught. He did not, at any point in the first week, say anything to Evelyn that could be characterized as either kind or unkind. On the 8th day, she stopped him as he came through the door. "The food stores," she said. He looked at her. "We have a problem," she said. "Can you sit down for a minute?" He sat down at the table. She sat across from him and spread out a piece of paper where she'd been tracking what they had, what they needed, and what the rate of consumption looked like. He looked at the paper. He looked at her. "You can read numbers," he said. "I can read everything," she said without heat. "The problem is here." She pointed at the column on the right. "We're short on meal, shorter on salt pork than you probably thought. And some of the dried stores have gone bad. Mice got in, I've been setting traps, but I need more than I have. If winter runs long, we're going to be in trouble." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the paper. "How short?" he said. "Depends on the winter. If it's mild, we're uncomfortable, but fine. If it's a hard winter," she paused. "We need to fix it before the first snow cuts us off. Do you have enough pelts for a trading run?" He leaned back in the chair, which creaked under him with a slightly alarmed sound. "I can make one more run before the mountain closes," he said. "Then I'll make you a list." She pulled the paper back toward her. "And I'll need it brought back exact if you can. No substitutions unless you send word of what you're substituting." He looked at her with that flat, gray, unreadable look. "You've done this kind of accounting before," he said. "My mother ran the household until she couldn't anymore," Evelyn said. "Then I did." A pause. "And where is she now?" "She died," Evelyn said. "When I was 11. Silence. The fire crackled. "I'll make the trading run," Rowan said. He got up from the table, the chair making its alarmed sound again as it was released from his weight. He went to the door, then stopped. "The list," he said. "Make it thorough." "Already am," she said. "Halt." It happened on the 16th day. Dinner that night was a stew she was reasonably proud of. She'd been slowly improving the camp cooking, introducing techniques gradually so as not to make the children feel like the food they'd been eating before was being condemned, which it was, but there was no reason to be obvious about it. The stew had dried venison, some root vegetables she'd found at the back of the stores, and enough seasoning to make it actually smell like something good. She was ladling it into bowls when Cade said, "Mother used to make this differently." Evelyn kept ladling. "She'd put juniper berries in," he said. His voice was controlled, almost casual. "It tasted better." "That sounds good," Evelyn said. "If you can find dried juniper berries in the stores, I'll add them next time." She didn't have to improvise with scraps, he said. William and George had gone still. Ada, across the table, was watching Cade with an expression that was hard to read. Not encouraging, not discouraging. "I'm working with what's here," Evelyn said. "What's here," Cade said, "is what's left after some town girl who doesn't know this mountain decided to reorganize everything." "The reorganizing was necessary," Evelyn said, still keeping her voice level. "The food stores were going to mold before... You know what?" He reached out and swept his bowl off the table. It hit the dirt floor and shattered, stew spreading in a dark spill across the boards Evelyn had spent 2 hours scrubbing that morning. The cabin went absolutely silent. Evelyn stood holding the ladle. Cade looked at her with all 16 years of his grief and his fury and his desperate need for things to not have changed, arranged on his face like armor. "Clean it up," he said. "That's what you're here for." Something shifted in Evelyn's chest. She could feel it happen. Not rage exactly, though rage was part of it. It was closer to the moment when you've been holding a door shut against a storm for so long that you stop fighting the door and just decide to let the storm in. She set the ladle down on the table, very carefully, with a small, precise click. Then she picked up a tin plate from the stack beside the pot, and she threw it, not at Cade. She threw it at the wall beside his head, hard, and the cabin rang with the impact of it, the sound bouncing off the log walls and the low ceiling and back again. Every child at that table flinched, even Ada. Cade had gone absolutely still. Evelyn walked around the end of the table. She was not a tall woman. She was perhaps 5'4", and Cade at 16 already had 4 inches on her. But she walked toward him with something in her posture that made him push his chair back anyway, involuntarily. She stopped 2 feet from him. "Listen to me," she said. Her voice was quiet. Not soft. Quiet has edges that soft doesn't have, and her voice had edges right now. "I know what you're doing. I understand it. You loved your mother, and I'm not her, and you don't want me here, and those are all real feelings, and I'm not dismissing them." His jaw was working. He wasn't speaking. "But this cabin," she said, "and everyone in it needs to survive the winter. That's the actual truth of where we are. It's not a feeling. It's math. We don't have the food or the firewood or the time for you to make my job harder than it already is. Your brothers and your sisters are going to get through this winter because I'm not going to let them not get through it. And you can either help me do that or you can get out of my way." She paused. "Your mother," she said, "kept her family alive. That's what she did. Every day she woke up and she kept them alive. I'm going to do the same thing. That's not disrespect. That's the continuation of what she started." His face had done something complicated and hard to look at directly. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with anger. "You don't know anything about her," he said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "No," Evelyn said. "I don't. And I'm sorry for that, honestly, but I know you." He stared at her. "Clean up the stew," she said. "Then sit back down and eat. The rest is still warm." She turned around and walked back to the pot. There was a very long silence behind her. Then she heard the sound of Cade moving, getting up from the chair, crossing the room. She heard him rummaging until he found the rag, and then she heard the sound of him cleaning up the mess he'd made. Nobody spoke. When she turned around with his filled bowl, he was back in his chair, his face arranged in the careful blankness of someone who has decided not to decide anything yet. She set the bowl in front of him. He didn't say thank you, but he ate. The door opened while she was still at the stove. She didn't hear it. She'd been focused on keeping the remaining stew warm and listening hard to the silence behind her to make sure it was staying stable. So when she turned around with the intention of pouring herself a bowl, she nearly walked into Rowan Vale's chest. She stopped. He stopped. He was still wearing his outdoor coat, still had snow melting in his beard, and he was looking past her at the table, reading the room the way people read it when they've walked into something they weren't expecting. He looked at Cade, who was eating. He looked at the stew on the floor that hadn't been completely cleaned up yet. He looked at the tin plate still sitting against the base of the far wall where it had landed. Then he looked at Evelyn. "Trouble?" he said. "Dinner," she said. His gaze went back to the table, to Cade specifically. "You all right?" he said to his son. Cade's jaw was tight. "Fine," he said. Rowan looked at him for another moment. Then he took off his coat, hung it on the peg by the door, sat down at the head of the table, and looked at Evelyn. "Is there enough?" he said. "Yes," she said. She filled his bowl and set it in front of him. He picked up his spoon, tasted the stew, and chewed. Then he looked at Cade. "Whatever she says goes," he said. "You understand that?" It wasn't a question. It wasn't particularly harsh. It was simply a statement, delivered in the tone of a man who says a thing once and means it and doesn't feel the need to say it twice. Cade looked at his father for a long moment. "Yes, sir," he said. Rowan nodded once. He picked up his spoon again. The cabin was very quiet, but it was a different quality of quiet now. Not the dangerous, coiled quiet of before, but something more like the quiet after a thunderstorm, when the air is wet and the tension has discharged and everything is just trying to settle back into its proper shape. Evelyn sat down at the far end of the table with her own bowl. She ate. She didn't smile. She wasn't sure she felt like smiling. But somewhere in the middle of her chest, where the burning thing usually lived, she felt something that wasn't quite triumph. It was quieter than triumph, more settled. And she thought, with a kind of grim and careful satisfaction, that she might possibly still be here in the spring. She intended to be. Mott. Late that night, after the children were asleep, she sat by the fire and looked at the paper with the food calculations on it. The numbers hadn't changed. The winter hadn't gotten shorter. The cabin was still cold in the corners where the fire couldn't reach, and there were still 10,000 things that needed doing, and she was still, in the technical sense of the arrangement, a girl who had been sold to settle a debt. But the fire was burning, the children had eaten, and somewhere outside in the black cold of the Bitterroot Mountains, the wilderness stretched out in every direction, enormous and indifferent, the way it always had been. Evelyn looked at the fire. She thought about her mother, which she tried not to do too often, because it hurt in a way that was hard to manage in practical situations. She thought about the woman who had kept a household running through poverty and illness, and a husband who was unreliable in every direction, who had taught Evelyn to read and to count, and to cook, and to mend, and to look at a problem without flinching, and to start from what was real rather than what she wished were true. She thought, she would not have broken here either. She thought, neither will I. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket. She banked the fire for the night, the way she'd figured out to do it so it would last until morning, and she found her place in the sleeping area, and she lay down in the dark. The mountain pressed down around the cabin. The wind moved through the pines outside with a sound like distant water. Evelyn closed her eyes. She did not sleep easily. She didn't particularly care. Easy things had never been the ones that counted. 3 weeks into the Bitterroot Mountains, Evelyn's hands stopped looking like her hands. She noticed it one morning while she was filling the water buckets at the creek, crouching on a rock shelf above the current, watching her own reflection break apart in the moving water. The hands in the reflection were chapped raw along the knuckles, split at 2 of the fingertips where the cold and the constant wet work had cracked the skin open in thin, precise lines that stung when she closed her fists. The nails were broken down to practical length. There was a burn scar forming on the inside of her left wrist from where she'd caught the edge of the pot 2 days ago and hadn't had time to do anything about it except press a cold cloth against it for 30 seconds before something else needed doing. She looked at those hands for a moment, then picked up the buckets and started back up the slope. The hill from the creek to the cabin was not long, but it was steep enough that hauling 2 full buckets up it every morning was the kind of task that built something in your body whether you wanted it to or not. She'd stopped feeling it in her arms after the first week, which she understood meant her arms had simply gotten stronger without consulting her about it. Her back still talked to her, especially in the evenings. She'd learned to work through it. Inside the cabin, Ada was awake, which was unusual. The girl was not a morning person by nature or by preference, and she made that preference known through a quality of silence that communicated profound personal offense at the existence of early hours. But this morning, she was sitting at the table in yesterday's dress with a piece of cloth in her hands and a needle she'd found somewhere, and an expression of deep concentration. Evelyn set down the buckets without comment and started building the fire. "I'm hemming Maisie's dress," Ada said, without looking up. "It's too long. She keeps tripping." "I noticed that," Evelyn said. "You know how to hem?" "Mother taught me." A pause. "I'm not asking for your opinion on it." "I wasn't going to give one," Evelyn said. She got the fire going and hung the first pot of water above it. "Though if you're doing a blind hem on that fabric, you'll want to catch less material per stitch, or it'll pucker when she runs." Silence. Then Ada said with visible reluctance, "Show me what you mean." Evelyn crossed the room, crouched beside the table, and pointed at the stitch pattern without touching the work. She explained it in 2 sentences. Ada looked at where she was pointing, then back at her stitching, then made a small adjustment without acknowledging that she'd done it. Evelyn went back to the fire. Neither of them mentioned it again. But the next morning, Ada was up at the same time, working on a tear in one of William's shirts, and she asked, without preamble, whether Evelyn knew how to do a proper patch stitch on rough woven material. It was not friendship. It was something much more cautious than that. A provisional, carefully bounded exchange. The kind of thing that could be revoked at any moment if either of them pushed too hard. But Evelyn understood that kind of thing. She'd grown up negotiating it. She took what Ada offered and did not ask for more. The mornings grew colder as October settled into the mountains. Frost appeared on the inside of the windows, which told Evelyn that the chinking between the logs needed attention before real winter arrived, because if cold air was getting through in October, it would be genuinely dangerous by December. She spent 2 days mixing a paste from ash and clay and pine pitch and working it into the gaps she could find, which was unpleasant work that involved standing on a ladder in the wind and getting the paste on everything, including her face and hair. And when she came inside the first evening looking like something that had been partially buried, George laughed so hard he fell off his chair. It was the first time she'd heard any of the children laugh since she'd arrived. She looked at him on the floor, red-faced and wheezing, and she felt something loosen in her chest. Not quite a laugh herself, but the precursor to one, the warmth that comes before the sound. "Glad you find it funny," she said, "since you're doing the second wall tomorrow." He stopped laughing. "I'm doing what?" "You and William. I'll mix the paste. You two can apply it." William, from across the room, made a noise that suggested he had opinions about this. "You'll do it faster than me anyway," Evelyn said. "You're both smaller. You can fit in the gaps I couldn't reach." This was partially strategic. She had in fact been able to reach most of the gaps fine. But it was also true enough not to be a lie. And it gave the boys a reason to do the work that wasn't just because she'd told them to. She'd learned that with the middle boys, reason mattered. They responded to logic the way Cade responded to directness. It gave them something to hold on to. The next day, both boys spent 3 hours on the exterior chinking without being asked twice. Rowan, returning that evening and finding them at it, paused at the edge of the yard and looked at Evelyn where she was stacking split wood near the cabin door. "That needed doing," he said. "Yes," she said. He watched his sons working for a moment. "I kept meaning to get to it." "Well," she said, lifting another log, "it's getting done." He was quiet for a moment and she could feel him deciding something, though she didn't know what. Then he said, "I'll be away for 3 days starting tomorrow. Trading run. The list you gave me." "All right. Cade knows the traps. He can walk you through them if something needs checking." "I know how to check a snare," she said, "but thank you." Another pause. "The list was good," he said. "The calculations." She looked up at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the boys on the ladder, his face doing that thing it did where whatever he was feeling went somewhere internal and unreachable. "I'll be back by the 3rd night," he said, "assuming the pass is clear." "And if it's not?" "Then 4 nights. He picked up a log from the pile and turned it in his hands with the automatic, unconscious assessment of someone who's been judging wood quality by feel for decades. "You'll be fine." It wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite reassurance. It was somewhere between the two. an acknowledgement that she was capable, and a statement that he'd noted it, compressed into 3 words the way Rowan Vale compressed most things. "I know," she said. He set the log down and went inside. She kept stacking wood until the light failed. The 3 days he was gone were not easy. They were also not a disaster, which Evelyn counted as a form of success. She ran the household on the schedule she'd been building. Fires by 5 in the morning, water up the hill by 6, breakfast, then the work of the day divided among whoever was available and cooperative. Maisie had begun following her like a small, solemn shadow, which was both touching and occasionally inconvenient, since the little girl had a habit of appearing directly underfoot at moments requiring rapid movement. But Evelyn had gotten used to talking to her while she worked, narrating what she was doing in the same low, explanatory voice she might use with herself. And Maisie had taken to responding in the brief, serious sentences of a child who considers words to be serious business. "Why do you stir it that way?" Maisie asked one afternoon, watching Evelyn work a pot of cornmeal mush. "Because if I stir it the other way, it clumps," Evelyn said. Maisie considered this with the gravity of a small judge. "Mother stirred it the other way," she said. "Then she probably had to break up the clumps," Evelyn said. "Some people don't mind them." "I don't mind them," Maisie said, as if establishing a position. "Noted," Evelyn said. "I'll leave some clumps in." Maisie watched her for another moment. Then she climbed up onto the bench beside the fireplace and sat there, her feet dangling, and said, "Your hair is different from Mother's." "I'd imagine so," Evelyn said. "Hers was darker and longer." "Mine's not very long right now," Evelyn agreed. "It had been longer before. She'd cut it herself 3 months ago with kitchen scissors because it had become unmanageable and she'd been tired of it." "I like it," Maisie said, with great seriousness. Evelyn looked at her. The little girl was watching her with those enormous dark eyes, her feet swinging slightly above the floor, her expression sincere in the way children's expressions are sincere before they learn to guard them. "Thank you, Maisie," Evelyn said. Maisie nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to the doll she'd been working on, a lopsided construction of rags and twine that was more conceptual than literal, but seemed to serve its purpose. Evelyn turned back to the mush and did not examine too closely what was happening in her throat just then. Cade, during Rowan's absence, existed in a state of armed neutrality. He did his work, checked the traps, brought in the game, split wood without being asked, and he stayed out of Evelyn's way, and she stayed out of his. Twice she caught him watching her with the same cataloging expression he'd had in the first days, and both times she met his gaze steadily until he looked away first. On the second night, she found him still awake after the others had gone to sleep, sitting near the low fire with a book open on his knee. A real book, which surprised her. She hadn't noticed books in the cabin. "Your mother's?" she asked, nodding at it. He looked up, looked at the book. "Yes," he said. "What is it?" A pause, like he was deciding whether to answer. "Natural history," he said. "Plants and animals. She used to read it to us." "Does she have others?" He looked at her with the expression of someone trying to figure out the angle. "There's a box," he said finally, "under the second bed. I don't think Dawn knows they're all still there." Evelyn nodded. She poured herself a cup of hot water. There was no proper tea, but she'd found some dried mint in the stores, and she'd been using it to make something close enough. And she sat down in the chair across the fire from him, not too close, with the clear bodily communication of someone who is going to sit here and not intrude on anything. Cade watched her suspiciously for a moment. Then he went back to his book. They sat like that for almost an hour, neither of them speaking, the fire between them burning down slowly, the wind outside moving through the pines. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was possible. The same way a fragile thing is possible to carry if you're careful and don't push it. When Evelyn finally said goodnight and went to her sleeping area, she thought she heard Cade say something very quiet behind her. She didn't ask him to repeat it, but she thought it might have been good night. Rowan returned on the third night, later than expected, but before she'd started seriously recalculating the food situation for an extended absence. He came through the door with 2 heavy packs and a look that said the trading had gone adequately and the pass had been annoying but passable. He set the packs on the table and unpacked them in silence while she inventoried the cornmeal, the salt pork, the dried beans, a thing of lard, some additional dried herbs, and, she paused, a paper-wrapped parcel she didn't recognize. "What's this?" she said. "Thread," he said, not looking up. "Various colors." Ada said the sewing supplies were low. Evelyn looked at the parcel, then at him. "Ada told you that?" "She left a note." He pulled out a folded scrap of paper and put it on the table. Written in a neat, careful hand was, "Thread and needles, if there's room. Dark colors." Evelyn held the note. She thought about Ada's careful, guarded face, the provisional morning sewing sessions, the way the girl communicated through action and oblique statement rather than anything as exposed as a direct request. She'd written a note to her father. That was not nothing. "Good," Evelyn said. She set the note down. "The count on the cornmeal is better than I projected. We should be in reasonable shape if winter doesn't run past March." "It usually does," Rowan said. "Then we'll be uncomfortable in March," she said, "but not starving." He looked at her across the table. The fire behind her put the light behind his face, so she couldn't read his expression clearly, which she'd noticed he seemed to prefer. There was something about Rowan Vale that found comfort in partial concealment. "You managed," he said. "We managed," she said, and meant it to include the children because it was true. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's one more thing." He reached into the pack and produced something else, a small, flat tin, the kind that held salve. He set it on the table between them. "For your hands," he said. He said it to the table, not to her. "The cold will get worse. Cracked skin can go bad if you're not careful." Evelyn looked at the tin. She thought about a dozen different things she could say, ranging from formal thanks to a deflection to a pointed inquiry about where exactly he'd found time to think about her hands in between trading pelts and navigating a mountain pass. She said none of them. "Thank you," she said instead, plainly. He nodded once, picked up the empty packs, and went to hang them by the door. She took the tin to her sleeping area and set it on the small wooden ledge she'd claimed for her few personal items between the tin cup with the dented rim and the short-handled knife she'd stolen from her father's kitchen and carried all the way up the mountain. She looked at those three objects for a moment, the cup, the knife, the tin of salve, and thought that they were an odd collection of things to constitute a life. She thought, "It's more than I had a month ago." She opened the tin, worked the salve into her cracked knuckles with the slow, careful pressure that was required, and felt the sting of it hit first and then, gradually, the relief underneath. Outside, the mountain was dark. The wind was picking up from the north, the way it did before a change in the weather. Evelyn lay down and listened to it, and for the first time since she'd arrived at this strange, freezing, difficult place, she did not lie awake making lists of everything that could go wrong. She simply listened to the wind and slept. The snow came in the last week of October, which Rowan said was early and which the mountains apparently didn't care about in the least. It came first as a gray suggestion in the sky, then as a few experimental flakes, and then as a committed, full-throated blizzard that ran for 3 days and transformed the world outside the cabin into a wall of white that had no visible edge or end. Evelyn stood at the window on the second morning of the storm, the cleaned window now so she could actually see through it, and looked out at nothing but white. "Is it always like this?" she asked. William, who was eating his breakfast behind her, said, "Last year it snowed for 6 days straight, and the horses couldn't leave the paddock for 2 weeks after." "Helpful," she said. "You asked," he said reasonably. She turned from the window. The cabin had a different quality in the blizzard, more compressed, more internal. The cold was structural now, part of the walls, and the fire had to work harder to hold its territory against it. She'd divided the children into 2-hour shifts for adding wood through the night, so neither the fire nor anyone maintaining it had to run past its capacity. The storm was also the first time she'd spent 3 consecutive days completely enclosed with Rowan Vale, who, under these circumstances, turned out to be a man who occupied space very quietly and seemed to have no particular need to fill silence with sound. He cleaned and repaired equipment by the fire. He sharpened things. He read occasionally from a book he kept in his coat pocket, and once when Maisie climbed into his lap without asking, he simply adjusted his position around her and kept reading without interrupting either activity. Evelyn observed this from across the room and thought, "He's not a bad man. He was never a bad man. He's just a man who doesn't know what to do with what's happened to him, and so he's been doing nothing, which is its own kind of damage." She kept the thought to herself. She wasn't here to fix Rowan Vale. She was here to get through the winter, but she watched him with Maisie in his lap, and she adjusted, slightly, the way she'd been thinking about this place and what it required of her. On the third night of the blizzard, the wind dropped suddenly around midnight, the way it does sometimes, just cuts out, like a sound that's been playing so long you stopped hearing it and then notice only when it stops. The silence woke Evelyn up. She lay in the dark and listened to it for a moment, and then she heard something else. Maisie was coughing. It was just a cough. Children coughed. Evelyn told herself this and lay still for another few minutes. But the coughing didn't stop. And after a while it changed, got a different texture to it, something wetter and more effortful than a simple clearing of the throat. And Evelyn was up and moving before she'd consciously decided to be. In the dim red light of the banked fire, Maisie was sitting up in her bedding, small and miserable, working for air with a sound that raised every hair on the back of Evelyn's neck. She crossed the room and put her hand on the child's forehead. The fever hit her palm like an open flame. "All right," she said quietly. To Maisie, to herself, to the darkness around them. "All right, I've got you." She began to work. The fever didn't break by morning. Evelyn had known it wouldn't. She'd known it within the first hour, when Maisie's temperature climbed instead of leveling off and the cough deepened into something that came from low in the chest, a wet, labored sound that had nothing in common with an ordinary winter cold. She'd heard a cough like that once before, when she was 12 years old, and her neighbor's youngest had taken sick in January, and she remembered very clearly how that had ended, which was why she didn't let herself think about it directly. She kept that memory at the edge of her attention like a fire she was walking near without looking at, and she focused instead on what was in front of her. What was in front of her was a 6-year-old girl struggling to breathe in a freezing mountain cabin in the middle of a blizzard with no doctor within 2 hours' ride, and the pass potentially closed until the storm finished deciding what it wanted to do. She worked with what she had. The pine steam was her first move. She'd heard her mother talk about it, the old treatment for lung sickness, boiling water and dropping pine needles and whatever other aromatic things you could find into it, and making the sick person breathe the steam while it was hot. She got the water boiling fast and stripped pine needles from the bundle she'd hung near the fire to dry in the first weeks, and she put in the dried mint she'd been using for tea and a scraping of pine pitch that she'd read somewhere had properties useful for the lungs, though she wasn't certain enough about that to count on it. She held Maisie over the steam with a cloth draped over both their heads, and talked to her quietly while the little girl coughed and cried and pushed against the heat. "I know," Evelyn said. "I know it's not comfortable. You're doing so well." "It's too hot," Maisie gasped. "I know, just a little longer." "I don't want to." "I know you don't. Hold on." The problem with the steam treatment was that it required someone to physically hold a feverish, struggling 6-year-old in position over a boiling pot without either of them getting burned. And that was the kind of task that used your whole body. By the time she came up from under the cloth after the second treatment, her hair was soaked, and her arms were shaking from the sustained effort of keeping Maisie's small, twisting body in place. Ada appeared at her shoulder. "Let me take her," Ada said. Evelyn looked at her. Ada's face was controlled in the way she always kept it controlled, but her eyes were doing something different. They were scared, and she wasn't bothering to hide it, which meant she was too scared to bother. "You know to keep her low over the steam," Evelyn said. "Not so close she scalds." "I know," Ada said. Evelyn relinquished Maisie, who went to her older sister with the desperate grip of a child reaching for something familiar, and straightened up and stood still for a moment while her back informed her it had opinions. Rowan was awake. He'd been awake most of the night, she thought. He was sitting at the far end of the room near the door, not close enough to be in the way, but not so far that he wasn't present, and he was watching everything with the expression of a man who is watching something he doesn't know how to fight, and the not knowing is the worst part. She crossed to him. "I need you to do something," she said quietly, so the children wouldn't hear the specificity of what she was asking. "Tell me," he said. Just that. His voice was low and steady, but there was something beneath it she hadn't heard from him before. "The willow bark in the stores. Do you know if there's any left? I was saving it for pain, but I need it now for the fever." "There's some," he said. "I'll find it. Also, if the storm is let up enough to get outside, I need packed snow. Clean snow from where nothing's walked on it. We can use it to cool her down when the fever spikes." He stood up. "Snow I can get." "Rowan." She said his name, which she didn't do often. They had settled into a way of talking to each other that rarely required names. He looked at her. "Don't go far. If the storm picks back up, I won't," he said. He put on his coat and went out. She watched the door close behind him and let out a breath, then turned back to the room. Cade was awake now too, standing in the doorway to the back sleeping area in yesterday's clothes, his hair badly angled from sleep. He looked at Ada holding Maisie over the pot. He looked at Evelyn. His face asked a question he didn't put into words. "It's bad," Evelyn said, because she'd decided in the first hour that she wasn't going to pretend otherwise to the people who needed to understand what they were dealing with. "But I've seen worse be handled. I need you to keep the fire at the right temperature. Not too high, or the cabin will get too dry. Not low, or we lose the heat. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. "And if I need a second set of hands, I'll ask." "I'll be here," he said. She nodded. She went back to Maisie. The morning wore on in the grim, distorted way that mornings do in a crisis, where time either moves too fast or stops making sense entirely. Evelyn ran the steam treatments every 2 hours, interspersed with the willow bark tea that Rowan had found and prepared without being asked twice. He ground the bark against a stone and steeped it in hot water and brought it to her, and she got as much of it into Maisie as the little girl would take, which was not as much as she'd have liked, but enough to work with. Maisie's fever peaked in the late morning, and it was bad. The child's skin was hot to the touch in a way that was frightening. Not just warm, but radiating, her small body working at a temperature it couldn't sustain. Evelyn packed clean snow against the backs of her wrists and the back of her neck, wrapped thin cloth around it so it wouldn't burn the skin, and held her and talked to her in the low, continuous voice she'd developed across the night. Not soothing exactly, more like orienting, the verbal equivalent of a hand in the dark, telling a person which way was solid ground. "Stay with me," she said. "That's the only thing you have to do. Stay with me." "I'm cold now," Maisie said. "Good. Cold is better than hot. Cold means it's working." "I feel sick." "I know." She shifted the snowpack. "I know you do. You're doing such a good job, Maisie." "I don't feel like I'm doing anything." "Surviving is something," Evelyn said. "It counts." The room behind her was quiet. She didn't look, but she knew the children were there. She could feel them distributed around the edges of the room, keeping out of her way, maintaining the fire, waiting. Even William and George, who were too young to know what to do with this kind of fear, had found their way to useful behavior. George was keeping the wood supply near the fire, replenished without being asked, and William had quietly taken over the water heating so Evelyn didn't have to monitor it. Rowan she could hear moving behind her, doing whatever needed doing. She'd stopped tracking it specifically, had simply registered that he was present and contributing without requiring direction, and filed that away. It was Cade she was most aware of. He'd positioned himself just behind her left shoulder, not close enough to crowd, far enough to give her working room. And every time she needed something, she found it appearing in her peripheral vision before she'd finished forming the request. An extra cloth, hot water in a fresh pot, a second blanket when Maisie went from burning to shivering. He moved quietly and efficiently and never said anything that wasn't a direct response to something she'd asked. And at some point around midday, she realized he'd been there for 6 hours without stopping and said, "Cade, sit down for a minute." "Down for a—" "I'm fine," he said. "I didn't ask if you were fine," she said. "Sit down." He sat down on the floor beside her, his back against the leg of the table. From that position, he was still close enough to help, but he wasn't on his feet, and after a few minutes, she heard his breathing slow from the slight elevation it had been carrying all morning. "She's going to make it?" he asked, quietly. Evelyn kept her hand on Maisie's forehead, monitoring. The fever was still high, but it hadn't climbed further in the last hour. "I think so," she said. "The fever's not going higher. If we can get it to start coming down in the next few hours, I think she'll turn the corner." A long pause. "Last winter," Cade said. Then he stopped. "I know," Evelyn said. She hadn't known the details of the previous winter, hadn't asked, but she'd pieced together enough from small things the children said and didn't say. "She had the same cough," he said. "Mother, before she—" He stopped again. Evelyn looked at him. His face was doing what faces do when a person is 17 years old and has lost too much and is terrified of losing more, which was to say it was doing everything at once and he was fighting all of it. "This isn't that," Evelyn said. "Your mother was already weakened before the winter. Maisie's been healthy, and we caught this early." "Because you were awake," he said. "Because I sleep light," she said. He looked at his little sister, the rise and fall of her chest, the slightly less tormented quality of her breathing compared to 6 hours ago. "You didn't have to do this," he said. You didn't owe us anything." Evelyn thought about that. "Maybe not," she said. "But she's 6 years old and she's scared and she's sick, and that's reason enough for me." Cade didn't say anything else. He sat on the floor beside her with his knees pulled up and his arms resting on them, and he stayed. Afternoon came. The blizzard outside had thinned to something that was more cold wind than active snowfall, and the light through the cleaned windows was flat and gray, and gave the cabin a quality of being held in suspension, as if the world outside had paused to see how this would go. Evelyn ran the last steam treatment of the afternoon and then sat back on her heels and put her hand to Maisie's face again, and this time the heat that met her palm was different. Not gone, not close to gone, but it had a different quality, less aggressive, less climbing. The fever was staying where it was rather than fighting upward. She let out a breath through her nose. "There," she said softly. Behind her she heard Rowan move. She heard him cross the room and stop, and she heard the particular quality of his silence change. The same way a sound changes when it's coming from a different place emotionally, though she couldn't have explained how she knew the difference. She looked up over her shoulder. He was standing 2 feet behind her, looking at Maisie. His face was... She'd seen a lot of his face now, across 2 months, and she'd gotten reasonably good at reading the parts of it that were readable. Right now it was doing something she hadn't seen before. Not relief exactly, not yet. It was the face of someone who has been braced for the worst, for so long that they don't know yet how to unbrace. "She's holding," Evelyn said. He exhaled. It was a long, slow exhale, the kind that comes from deep enough that it takes a while to finish. "The fever," he said, "still high, but it's not climbing. I think the worst of it is past." He looked at her, just for a moment, direct and unguarded in a way that he usually wasn't, and she looked back at him, and whatever passed between them in that 3 seconds was not something that either of them would have been able to articulate, but was real, nonetheless. Then he looked back at Maisie. "What do you need?" he said. "Keep the fire steady through the night. I'll do the steam again in the morning if she's still showing fever. Make sure everyone eats something. The children haven't had a proper meal today." She paused. "And someone should sleep so there's a person with a functional brain available by morning." "You sleep," he said. "I'm not—" "I'll watch her," he said. "I know what to look for now. If the breathing changes or the fever climbs, I'll wake you." She looked at him. "You've been up for close to 30 hours, he said. "You're useful to her awake. You're not useful to her collapsed." It was the most pragmatic argument for her own welfare she'd ever encountered, and somehow that made it easier to accept than kindness would have. "Wake me if anything changes," she said. "I will," he said. She didn't sleep deeply. Her body wasn't going to allow that, not with everything running just below the surface. But she slept, in the shallow way of someone whose vigilance has temporarily released her, and might take her back at any moment. She woke twice, found Rowan sitting beside Maisie with his hand resting near the child's head, close but not touching, and went back to sleep both times. By the second morning, the fever had broken. Not dramatically, not with any particular announcement. She woke at 5 and went to check, and Maisie's skin was damp and cool, and her breathing was just breathing again, the ordinary in and out of a sleeping child rather than the effortful labor it had been. Evelyn sat beside her and pressed her fingers to the inside of her wrist and counted, and the pulse was even and appropriate, and she sat there for a moment with her eyes closed and let herself feel the simple, enormous relief of it. "Well," she said, to no one in particular. She became aware that she was not alone. She opened her eyes and looked. Cade was on the floor against the far wall, asleep sitting up, his head dropped to one side. He had a blanket over his legs that someone, Rowan, she thought, had put there at some point in the night. His hands were open in his lap, relaxed for the first time since she'd arrived. He'd stayed all night. She looked at him for a moment, This difficult, grieving 17-year-old boy who had been working himself to the bone for this family since before she arrived and had no idea what to do with her, but had spent the last 2 days following her instructions without hesitation because the situation had made it clear what mattered and what didn't. She got up carefully so as not to wake either of them, and she built the morning fire, and she put on water for the willow bark tea Maisie would still need for the next few days, and she stood at the window while she waited for it to heat. Outside, the blizzard was done. The mountain was buried in white, the pines carrying their loads of snow with the stoic patience of things that have been doing this for a long time. The sky above the ridge was the clear, particular blue that only happens after a storm. Washed clean, very sharp, very cold, very present. She stood there looking at it and realized her hands had stopped shaking. She hadn't noticed when that had happened. The door opened behind her. She turned to find Rowan coming in from outside, his beard carrying frost, carrying a load of split wood. He looked at her, then at the fire, then at Maisie sleeping quietly in her bedding. "The breathing," he said. "Normal," Evelyn said. "Fever broke around 5. He set the wood down. He straightened up and looked at his daughter for a long moment, with that face she was still learning to read, and then he did something she hadn't seen him do before. He put one hand over his face and held it there for a moment, just a moment, and then he took it away and his face was composed again. She looked away. She gave him that. "There's tea ready in a few minutes," she said. "The children will need to eat before it gets late." "All right," he said. His voice was slightly rough, slightly off the register it usually occupied. He cleared his throat. "Evelyn." She looked back at him. He was looking at her now, direct, in that brief unguarded way he'd shown the day before. His face said something that his words were apparently going to take a different shape around. "You held this family together," he said, "these 2 days." She waited to see if there was more. "I don't," he started, then stopped, in the way of a man whose words don't come easily and who is trying to find the right ones rather than substitute easier ones. "I want you to know I see that." Evelyn looked at him. This enormous, weather-hardened, largely impenetrable man who had bought her from her father's debt and brought her up a mountain and given her a freezing, filthy cabin and a family that hadn't wanted her, and who was now standing in his own doorway trying to tell her, in the only vocabulary he had, that it mattered. "I know you do," she said, plainly, without performance. He nodded once. From across the room, Maisie stirred and made a small sound. Both of them looked. The little girl was trying to sit up. Her face was pale and hollowed out by the fever, but her eyes were open, and she was looking around the cabin with the slow, reassembling awareness of someone coming back from somewhere very far away. Her eyes found Evelyn. "I'm hungry," Maisie said, in a voice that was rough but present. Behind Evelyn, she heard a sound from Cade, a short, involuntary exhale that could have been a laugh or could have been something else entirely. She didn't look. She crossed the room to Maisie instead and crouched down beside her and felt her forehead one more time, and it was cool under her hand, and she thought, "There it is." "Good," Evelyn said. "That's very good. Let's get you some tea first, and then we'll see about food." "I don't want tea," Maisie said. "Tea tastes wrong." "I know," Evelyn said. "Drink it anyway." Maisie looked at her with the aggrieved expression of a small person who has survived something significant and feels this should result in concessions. "Fine," Maisie said. Evelyn almost smiled. She didn't quite, but it was close enough. She poured the tea. She helped Maisie sit up. She listened to the sound of the cabin coming back to life around her. William and George emerging from the back room, Ada appearing and going immediately to her sister without a word, Rowan moving at the edges of everything, keeping the machinery of the morning running. The fire held. The water heated. Outside, the white mountain sat under its blue sky, indifferent as always, saying nothing about what had almost happened in the night and nothing about what came next. That was all right. Evelyn didn't need the mountain to tell her anything. She already knew they were going to be fine. She wasn't certain yet what fine looked like from here. She wasn't certain what she was building in this place exactly, or what it would eventually become. But she'd kept a 6-year-old alive through a mountain blizzard with pine steam and willow bark tea and 30 hours of not stopping, and the family she'd arrived to as a stranger had worked alongside her without being asked, because when it came down to it, when the real thing arrived, they had known what mattered. That was something. In this wilderness, she was learning, something was almost always enough to keep going. Winter released its grip on Bitterroot Ridge the way it always did. Not all at once, not with any particular generosity, but in increments that required you to pay attention to notice them. A degree of warmth in the midday air. The quality of light shifting from the flat white of deep winter to something with more color in it. The sound of meltwater starting up under the snowpack, invisible but audible if you put your ear to it. Evelyn noticed all of it. She'd become, over the course of the winter, a person who noticed things about the mountain that she wouldn't have had the vocabulary for 5 months ago. She knew which way the wind had to come from to mean snow was following. She knew the sound the pines made when the temperature was about to drop hard overnight, versus the sound they made when it was just cold without dropping further. She knew which section of the creek froze first and which stayed open longest, and she knew how to read the ice to tell if it was safe to cross with a loaded pack. She knew what a fox track looked like versus a coyote track, and she knew which of the traps Rowan had set around the property needed checking most urgently after a storm. She'd learned all of it the way you learn things when you don't have the option of not learning them. Through repetition, through error, through paying attention, because the alternative was being caught unprepared, and being unprepared in the Bitterroot Mountains had consequences that didn't forgive. It was Cade who'd taught her most of it. That had happened gradually, without either of them deciding it was happening. He'd mentioned something in passing, the way a cloud formation over the North Ridge meant weather, the reason you approached a snare from downwind, and she'd listen and file it away and ask a follow-up question, and he'd answer, and somewhere in the accumulation of those exchanges, a channel had opened between them that was not exactly friendship and not the armed neutrality of the early weeks, but something functional and real that had its own particular character. He still wasn't easy. He was 17 and he was carrying more than a 17-year-old should carry, and he had a temper that showed itself in brief, sharp flares when things didn't go the way he'd planned. But he directed none of it at her anymore. And twice over the winter she'd caught him correcting William or George when they were careless about something in a way that sounded, in the cadence of it, faintly like her. She didn't mention that either. March came and was difficult the way Rowan had predicted. The food stores ran low enough that meals got smaller, and everyone understood without it being said that smaller meals were the current reality and complaining about it was not useful. The children adapted without drama, partly because they were mountain children and understood scarcity in the practical, unsentimental way that people understand things they've always lived with, and partly because Evelyn had managed the reduction slowly enough that no single day felt like a dramatic loss. She was proud of that, not in a way she said out loud, but in the quiet internal way of a person who knows they did something right. Rowan, during the last hard weeks of winter, had been ranging further for game and coming back later, and sometimes she'd hear him come in well after midnight and get up in the morning to find fresh meat hanging outside the door, a deer haunch, a pair of rabbits, without any mention of how far he'd gone to get it or what that cost him. She started leaving a covered pot near the fire for him on the night she expected him late. She didn't make a point of it. He didn't comment on it. It simply became one of the arrangements that constituted the life they were running in parallel, close enough to intersect, but still leaving each of them their separate space. She thought about that sometimes, in the way she thought about things that didn't have a clear category yet, turned it over and looked at it from different angles without arriving at a conclusion. By the first week of April, when the pass had cleared enough that the wagon could make the run down to Black Hollow for the spring supply replenishment, Evelyn had been in the Bitterroot Mountains for almost exactly 5 months. She looked different. She knew this not from vanity. There was no mirror in the cabin, and she'd stopped missing that within the first month. But from the evidence of her hands and her posture and the way her body moved through the work of the day, which was without the hesitation it had carried at the beginning, she was stronger than she'd been. Her face had gone leaner from the hard winter, and the cold had put color in it that hadn't been there before. She'd cut her hair again, shorter this time, practical. She also, she was aware, carried herself differently. The girl who had climbed into the back of Rowan Vale's wagon in October with a burlap sack and the look of someone trying not to show fear had been replaced by a woman who walked through a freezing mountain cabin at 5 a.m. and got things done before anyone else was awake, and who had kept 5 children and one largely self-sufficient man functional through a hard winter, and who had won the particular kind of confidence that doesn't come from being told you're capable, but from finding out for yourself under conditions that didn't lie about the results. It was Rowan who brought up the supply run first. He mentioned it one morning with the same flat practicality he brought to everything. The pass was clear, the stores needed replenishing, he was going down to Black Hollow in 2 days. "I'll come," Evelyn said. He looked at her across the table. "You don't need to," he said. Not dismissively, more like he was checking. "I know I don't need to," she said. "I have a list. I want to make sure it comes back right." A pause. "All right," he said. She saw something in Ada's face when she said she was going, a brief, complicated expression that was there and gone too fast to fully read. That night, Ada brought her the traveling coat she'd been mending over the winter, Evelyn's own coat, which had come up the mountain in better shape than most things, and had been repaired and reinforced in the cold months until it was considerably more functional than when it started. "The hem was coming loose," Ada said, handing it over. "I fixed it." Evelyn looked at the coat. The hem was perfect. Small, even stitches, the kind that held. "Thank you, Ada," she said. Ada lifted one shoulder. "You should look decent when you go down there," she said. It was the most Ada had ever said about anything that involved caring about Evelyn's welfare, and she clearly found the experience mildly uncomfortable because she left the room immediately after. Evelyn held the coat and thought, 5 months. 5 months ago, this girl would have watched her fall into the creek without moving a muscle. She put the coat on. It fit better than it used to. That meant something too, she decided. The morning they left, the children came out to see them off with varying degrees of expressed interest. William and George had questions about what she was going to get and whether there would be any candy, which she answered honestly. Maybe, but it was not the priority. And they accepted this with the philosophical resignation of children who know when they're pushing the realistic limit of a request. Maisie, recovered fully from the fever and back to her usual small, serious self, came up to Evelyn and held out a piece of twine she'd been braiding. "For your wrist," Maisie said. "So you come back." Evelyn crouched down and held out her wrist. Maisie tied the braid around it with great ceremony. "Thank you," Evelyn said. Maisie studied her work, satisfied, and stepped back. Cade was leaning against the fence post at the edge of the yard. He hadn't said anything. He met her eyes when she walked past him toward the wagon, and he gave her a short nod. The kind that meant something specific, that had weight in it, that she'd earned. She nodded back. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. Rowan took the reins. The horses started down the mountain road, and the cabin and the children disappeared into the trees behind them. The road down to Black Hollow took 2 hours, and Rowan drove it the way he drove everything, with focus and without excessive conversation. And Evelyn sat beside him and watched the mountain give way slowly to the foothills, and then to the lower elevation where the snow had already retreated and the mud season had arrived in full committed force. The last mile into town was a mess of churned earth and standing water that the wagon navigated with the resigned competence of horses who had done this before. Black Hollow in spring was not an improvement over Black Hollow in any other season. It was a modest town of maybe 200 people arranged along a main street with enough commerce to sustain itself and enough smallness that everyone knew everyone else's business and had opinions about it. The buildings were functional rather than pleasant. The street was mud. Several dogs were engaged in a territorial dispute near the blacksmiths that nobody was making any effort to stop. But people came out to watch the wagon come in, the way they always did. That hadn't changed. Evelyn felt the attention gather as the wagon rolled down the main street, and she kept her posture even and her gaze forward and let them look. She'd known this moment was coming, had thought about it in the abstract over the winter, from a distance, but the reality of it was different from the thought, because the reality included the specific faces of specific people she'd known her whole life. People who had stood on this street in October and watched her leave with the expressions of a town watching a cautionary tale begin. She saw Mrs. Calloway from the dry goods store pause in her doorway. She saw Tom Hester, who ran the livery, stop what he was doing and stand with a horseshoe in his hand, just watching. She saw 2 women she'd known her whole life, Margaret Frome and her sister, the kind of women who existed in every small town and had made an entire social career out of knowing things and spreading them. Paused their conversation and watched the wagon with the calculating attention of people rapidly revising their expectations. She kept her eyes forward. Rowan pulled up in front of the general store and set the brake. He got down first, and then he held up a hand for her, and she took it and stepped down from the wagon with the natural ease of someone who had been climbing on and off wagon seats in mud all winter. The gesture was not lost on the people watching. She registered that from the corner of her attention and said nothing about it. Inside the general store, Ed Maher was behind the counter. Ed Maher had run the store for 20 years and had the quality of all long-term general store operators, which was that he'd seen enough of life to find very little of it surprising. But he looked at Evelyn with something she could only describe as recalibration, a visible adjustment of what he'd been expecting. "Miss Mercer," he said, then uncertain. "Or Mrs. Vale?" "Evelyn is fine," she said, and put her list on the counter. "I'll need all of this filled. Where I've written the quantity, that's exact. Don't substitute volume for weight on the grain. It makes the calculations wrong on the other end." Ed Maher looked at the list. He looked at her. He started pulling things from the shelves. The store was not empty. There were 3 other people in it when they walked in, and 2 more came in while she was reviewing the list with Rowan, and none of them were there entirely by coincidence. She could feel the attention of the room, the way you feel a change in pressure. Not hostile exactly, but weighted with the specific quality of people watching something they'd predicted go differently than predicted. It was Margaret Frome who spoke first. She came in through the front door, nominally to buy flour, and she stationed herself at the near end of the counter with the flour as a prop and said, to the air between herself and Evelyn, "Well, you stayed." "I did," Evelyn said. "We thought—" Margaret paused, choosing the phrasing. "Well, the winter up there is hard. We thought you might come back down." "It was hard," Evelyn agreed pleasantly. She turned back to the counter. "Ed, this salt pork. I'll need the cured, not the fresh. The fresh won't keep right on the ride back up." "Right," Ed said, already moving. "You look—" Margaret tried again, with the persistence of someone who had a point to make and was going to find the angle for it. "You look different." "5 months in the mountains will do that," Evelyn said. "And the children?" This from the other woman, Margaret's sister Ruth, who had materialized from somewhere near the back of the store. "Rowan's children. Are they manageable?" There was something in the question that Evelyn recognized, the particular, slightly prurient concern of people who have written a specific story about a situation and want confirmation that the story is the right one. She'd heard it her whole life, the tone of people who found other people's difficulties interesting. "They're fine," she said. "They're good children." "Cade Vale is half wild, I've heard," Margaret said, with the confidence of someone reporting established fact. "The eldest. They say he checked the snares every morning this winter without being asked," Evelyn said, "and sat up 2 nights straight when his sister had a fever. That's not wild. That's reliable." Margaret blinked. Rowan, standing a few feet behind Evelyn near a display of tool parts he'd been assessing, did not turn around. But she saw his shoulders move very slightly, with something that was not a laugh but was adjacent to one. She went back to the supply list. It was when Ed reached for the ledger to record the order under the Vale account that he said, with the specific awkwardness of someone who's thought about whether to say a thing and decided to do it anyway, "Your father came in last week. Callum." Evelyn's hand, which had been reaching for the pencil to mark off the items, stopped. She put the pencil down. "Did he?" she said. "He was asking about you. Whether you'd come back down yet." Ed's voice was carefully neutral. Whether the arrangement had held. The store had gone quieter. The 2 other customers were performing elaborate pantomimes of examining things on shelves while listening completely. "The arrangement held," Evelyn said. "He seemed—" Ed paused. "He mentioned the debt. He said he hoped the situation had been satisfactory for all parties." Something moved through Evelyn's chest. She recognized it. Not quite anger, more like the specific chill that comes when you understand clearly what a person is, when all the wishing you'd done that they were different finally finishes and settles into plain recognition. Satisfactory for all parties. She thought about the burlap sack, the October morning, her father's bloodshot eyes looking somewhere past her because he couldn't hold eye contact with the things he'd done. She straightened up at the counter. "If my father asks again," she said to Ed, clearly enough for the room, "you can tell him the debt was settled. That's done. And you can tell him that whatever he thinks he's owed after that, conversation, information, anything else, he's not owed it. Not by me." The store was very quiet. Ed looked at her for a moment, then nodded once, slowly. "I'll tell him," he said. She picked up the pencil again and marked the last items on the list. Then the door opened. Callum Mercer had not been invited to this moment, but he arrived in it anyway, the way he'd always arrived in moments, without reading the room, without understanding what he was walking into, driven by something that wasn't quite intention but was more like a habit of wanting things from people who had stopped wanting to give them. He looked older than 5 months should have made him. The drink did that. She'd seen it happen progressively for years. His coat was the same coat. His hands were the same hands. He looked at Evelyn, and then he looked at Rowan, and then he looked back at Evelyn, and she watched him assemble a version of an expression that he apparently hoped would read as paternal warmth. "Evie," he said. Nobody called her that anymore. She'd never particularly liked it. "Callum," she said. "Not father. Not dad. Callum." He noticed. His expression wavered. "You look well," he said. "The mountain agreed with you." "I worked for that," she said. "It didn't agree with anything. I made it work." He came further into the store with the forward momentum of someone who has planned this opening and is committed to it. "I thought we could... There's some things I wanted to say, Evie, about how things were arranged. I want you to know I..." "Callum?" Her voice was level. The room was absolutely still. "I don't need it." He stopped. "Whatever you were going to say," she said. "Whatever version of sorry or explanation or asking me to understand, I don't need it. It won't change anything, and I don't have feelings about it that need managing." She held his gaze, which was easier than she'd expected. "I'm not angry at you. I'm not anything at you. That's the truth." His face did something complicated. She thought he might argue or appeal or do the thing he'd always done when he wanted something from her. Make himself into something smaller and more pathetic than he needed to be so she'd feel responsible for fixing it. He looked instead at the floor. He started. "The debt is cleared," she said. "That was the arrangement. It's done now. You should go home." A pause that lasted long enough to become something. Then Callum Mercer turned around and walked back out the door. The store remained silent. Into that silence, Rowan Vale moved. He walked from where he'd been standing near the tool display, and he came to stand beside Evelyn at the counter. Not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her, with the specific placement of someone making a spatial argument about where they stood in relation to another person. He put his hand against the small of her back. Not possessively. It wasn't that. It was steadying, the way a hand steadies something that doesn't necessarily need steadying, but that recognizes the gesture for what it is. He looked at the room, at Margaret and Ruth, at the other customers who had given up pretending to look at shelves, at Ed Meyer behind the counter. "She runs the household," he said, "up on the ridge. She has since October." He said it the way he said things that were simply facts, without decoration, without asking anyone to respond to it in any particular way. "I want that understood." Ed Meyer was the one who answered, with the quiet authority of a man who'd spent 20 years being the fixed point in a town that shifted around him. "Understood," he said. Margaret and Ruth said nothing, but their faces had shifted into something that was the beginning of understanding that the story they'd been telling about this situation was the wrong story. Rowan dropped his hand. He looked at the list. "Is everything filled?" "Almost," Evelyn said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. "Then let's get it loaded," he said. She helped Ed Meyer box the supplies, going through the list one more time with the methodical attention she brought to things she wanted done right. When everything was checked and loaded into the wagon, she climbed back up to the seat and looked at Black Hollow one more time. The muddy street, the low buildings, the faces of the people who'd come out to watch, as they always came out to watch, because that's what small towns ran on. She looked at all of it. She thought about the girl who had stood on this street in October with a burlap sack and tried not to show her face. She thought, that girl is not gone. She's just further in, behind everything that got built on top of her. Rowan climbed up and took the reins. The wagon began to move. As they pulled away from the store, she heard Margaret Frome say something to her sister, not loud enough to catch the words, only the tone. And the tone was not what it had been in October. Something had shifted in it. Something had recalibrated. She didn't look back to check. She didn't need to. The wagon rolled through the mud and out of Black Hollow, and the mountain road began its climb ahead of them, and Evelyn sat with her hands in her lap and felt the weight of Maisie's braided cord at her wrist, and thought about the list she still needed to update when she got back, and whether there was enough meal to try the bread recipe Ada had asked about last week. They were halfway up the mountain road, in the steep section where the horses needed the most from you, and the trees closed in from both sides and the town below had completely disappeared, when Rowan said, without preamble, "You didn't have to do that." "Do what?" she said. "With your father." He kept his eyes on the road. "You didn't owe anyone that kind of accounting, not in public like that." She thought about it. "I wasn't doing it for them," she said. A pause. "No," he said. "I know." The road climbed, the horses worked. Above them, through a break in the trees, she could see the ridge, still snow-capped, still enormous, still entirely indifferent to whether either of them made it back up there. She was going to make it back. She already knew that. She turned her face toward the mountain and let the cold air hit it, and felt, not happiness exactly, which was too simple a word for what was happening in her chest, but something strong and clear and hers, that she'd built from nothing in a place that hadn't wanted her, and that nobody was going to take. The supplies lasted better than she'd projected. Evelyn noticed this in mid-April, when she did the monthly count and realized they had more meal left than the calculation suggested they should, which meant either her math had been conservative or the family had been quietly eating less than their allotted portions without saying anything. She suspected both. She didn't bring it up. She just adjusted the spring meals upward and said nothing about it, and watched everyone eat with slightly more ease, and counted that as a kind of victory that didn't need a name. Spring on the Bitterroot Ridge was not the gentle thing that spring was supposed to be in the imagination. It was muddy and loud and smelled strongly of everything the snow had been covering for 5 months, which was considerable. The melt came fast in the second week of April, and the creek behind the property turned from a quiet, cold thing into something that ran hard and noisy over its banks for 3 days before it settled back into its channel and behaved again. The yard was a disaster of mud that grabbed your boots at every step and held them with the specific, vindictive persistence of mud that has been waiting all winter for the opportunity. The children were electric with the change. William and George disappeared into the woods for hours at a stretch, coming back with mud on every surface and the barely suppressed energy of boys who have been inside too long. Even Ada, who maintained her composure with impressive consistency, took to sitting outside on the front step in the afternoons when the sun hit it directly, reading the natural history book from her mother's collection with her face turned up to catch the light. Evelyn watched all of it from wherever she was working and felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. A particular full feeling, like a room that had been furnished gradually, and you hadn't noticed until you looked up one day and realized it was complete. It wasn't contentment exactly. She'd have been suspicious of anything she called contentment, because contentment had always seemed to her like a thing that required conditions she'd never had access to. It was more like solidity, the sense of standing on ground that she'd tested and found to hold her weight. She was still figuring out what to call it when Rowan did something that unsettled the question entirely. It was an evening in late April, after supper, when the days had gotten long enough that there was still light at 7 o'clock, and the air had enough warmth in it that sitting outside wasn't an act of endurance. She was on the front step, working through a mending pile that had accumulated over the winter, coats and trousers, and the relentless progression of children's clothes encountering the wilderness at full speed. The children were inside. Rowan had been out checking the far trap since mid-afternoon. She heard him come back across the yard and registered his footsteps without looking up. She'd learned to distinguish his walk from the others by now, the particular weight and cadence of it. He sat down on the step beside her, not across the yard, not inside. Beside her, on the step, close enough that she was aware of the presence of him, the way you're aware of a fire. Not unpleasant, just significant. She kept sewing. He was quiet for a while, which was not unusual. What was slightly unusual was that he'd chosen this particular spot for the quiet, instead of his chair inside or the fence post he favored when he wanted to look at the mountain. "These traps were good," he said eventually. "How good?" 3 marten and a fox. Good pelts." "Early for marten," she said. "Sometimes." He stretched his legs out in front of him. The winter ran them down from the high ridges. "They're moving around." She finished a seam and bit the thread. She held the coat up to check it in the last of the daylight, turning it to look at the line of the stitch. "Evelyn," he said. She lowered the coat. He was looking at the ridge, at the line where the pines ended and the rock faces began, still snow-covered at the top but showing darker stone lower down. His profile in the evening light was the same as always, heavy, weathered, giving nothing away easily. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment that ran slightly longer than it needed to, and she understood he was choosing words the way he always chose words, carefully, because he didn't like spending them on things he didn't mean. "You've been here 7 months," he said. "Almost 8, she said. "Almost 8. He looked at the ridge. "The arrangement was for the household. That was what I told you. That's what I told them in town." "That's what it was," she said. "It became something else," he said. Not an accusation. More like an observation being made aloud, the same way he'd observed the behavior of weather, as a fact that required acknowledgement. She waited. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want to say that first. I haven't been good at this since Margaret died. I got through it by not stopping, mostly. You keep moving, you don't look at it directly, it can't knock you down. That was the theory." "I know," she said quietly. "I've used the same theory." He looked at her then. "I know you have." A moment between them, in the cooling air, with the light going gold and slanted over the ridge above. "The children are better," he said. "That's you. I know what I am and what I'm not, and I'm not the thing they needed this winter. You were." He paused. "Cade is... He's more himself than he's been in a year." Maisie started talking in full sentences again. "Did you know she'd stopped? For 6 months after her mother died, she barely spoke. She's been talking my ear off for 2 months now." Something in his voice changed on that last part. Something private and careful. "I noticed," Evelyn said. "You notice most things," he said. She didn't dispute it. He picked up a small piece of bark from beside the step and turned it in his hands, the way he handled things when he was working through something. "What I want to ask is whether you'd stay. Not as the housekeeper. The other thing, whatever this has been." She looked at him. He was still looking at the bark in his hands, with the expression of a man who has said what he needed to say and is now waiting for the ground to either hold or not hold under him. "That's not a particularly romantic proposal," she said. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the infrastructure of one. "No," he said. "I don't think I'm going to do better than that." "I don't need better than that," she said. He looked up. "I need honest," she said. "I've been living with people who weren't honest my whole life, and I'd rather have plain and true than anything that sounds good but isn't." She held his gaze, which she could do without effort now. She'd learned the geography of his face well enough to navigate it. "So tell me plain, what are you actually asking?" "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "As my wife, in law and in practice. I'm asking you to be what you've already been, except knowing that I want it to be permanent, and I want it to be chosen, not just survived." The last word landed with a weight that she recognized, the weight of a person who understands exactly what it means to survive something rather than choose it, and who has thought about the difference. She was quiet for a moment. Not because she was uncertain. She understood, somewhere in the clear, practical part of herself, that she'd been building toward this particular ground for 8 months, and that it was solid. But because the moment deserved a moment. Because she wanted to answer from the right place, not from reaction or gratitude or the reflexive agreement of a person who had been conditioned to accommodate others. She wanted to answer from herself. "Yes," she said, "on one condition." He waited. "We tell the children together. Tomorrow morning, all of them at the table. I won't have them find out sideways." He nodded slowly. "That's fair. And Cade, he'll need time with it. Don't expect him to be fine with it immediately." "He's not going to be," Rowan agreed. "He'll be Cade about it." "I know how to handle Cade about things," she said. "I know you do." Something settled in his face. The unbracedness she'd seen in glimpses. The moment over Maisie's fever. The moment in the store. But more sustained now. Less likely to be taken back. "I know," The light finished going gold and shifted to the softer, grayer color of near dark. Inside the cabin, she could hear the sounds of the children, George and William arguing about something with the low-level persistence of brothers, Ada's voice cutting across it with a single sentence that apparently resolved the argument because it went quiet, Maisie's voice asking a question of someone and the murmur of response. The sounds of a household, of people living in a place together. She sat on the step in the near dark and listened to it, and understood that she had built this. Not alone, Rowan had kept the food coming all winter, and the children had chosen her in their various slow, sideways ways, and the mountain itself had done the work of stripping everything down to what was real. But she had been the central thing, the constant, the one who hadn't left, and this was the result. It wasn't perfect. It was muddy and cold, and the cabin needed work on the north-facing wall, and Cade still had his difficult weeks, and Ada still communicated primarily through controlled silences, and the food was always a calculation, and winter was only 6 months away, and would be hard again. And then again after that, indefinitely, because that was the nature of where they were. And she was going to stay. The morning they told the children, Evelyn made breakfast first. She'd learned that difficult conversations went better on a full stomach. Not because food made anything easier, but because hunger made everything harder, and she was practical about these things. She made the cornmeal properly, and there was actual coffee, a luxury from the spring supply run. And she put it on the table with the same ordinary movements of an ordinary morning, and she let the children wake up and come to the table in their usual order. Then she sat down, and Rowan sat down across from her, and she looked at each of the 5 faces arranged around the table. "We need to tell you something," she said. The table went alert. Not alarmed. There was a quality difference between alert and alarmed that she'd learned to read across the winter, but present, paying attention. "Your father asked me to stay permanently," she said. "As his wife, legally. I said yes." Silence. William said, "Does that mean you're our mother?" "No," Evelyn said, clearly and without hesitation. "You had a mother. That's not replaced. I'm something else. I don't have a perfect word for it." "You're the one who kept Maisie alive," George said, with the blunt accuracy of a 10-year-old who hadn't yet learned to soften things. "We all kept Maisie alive," Evelyn said. "Your father found the willow bark. Cade didn't sleep for 2 days. Ada took over when I couldn't hold her anymore. We all did that." Maisie, who had been watching this exchange with the judicial seriousness that was her natural operating mode, said, "I want you to stay." Simple. Declarative. Like a verdict being delivered. "Good," Evelyn said. "I'm staying." Ada hadn't spoken. Evelyn looked at her, at the careful, measured face of the 14-year-old girl who had grown up faster than she should have, and guarded everything she felt with the dedication of someone who'd learned that feelings exposed were feelings that could be used against you. Ada met her gaze. "You're not going to change everything," Ada said. It wasn't quite a question. "Some things need changing," Evelyn said. "Some things don't. I'll try to know the difference." A pause. "You haven't been bad at it so far," Ada said. High praise, from Ada. Evelyn looked at Cade last. He was sitting at the end of the table where he always sat, his coffee cup in both hands, looking at the table. His jaw was the particular angle it went when he was holding something in place by effort rather than by it being naturally still. She waited. He looked up. His eyes? His father's eyes. That flat gray that had looked at her with open hostility in October, that had followed her movements with strategic suspicion in the early weeks, that had watched her from the floor beside her during Maisie's fever with something that had no name yet, were complicated now in a way she'd learned to respect rather than try to simplify. "You're not going anywhere," he said. It came out half statement, half something that might have been a question disguised as a statement. "No," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Okay, oh," he said. Just that. "Okay." But the way he said it, the specific, quiet, effortful way of a 17-year-old boy who has decided to put something down that he'd been carrying, told her everything she needed to know about what it cost him and what it meant. "Okay," she said back. Rowan reached for the coffee. "Eat your breakfast," he said to the table. "The south pasture fence needs 2 people this morning." And like that, the conversation was over, and the morning continued. That was how Evelyn Mercer became Evelyn Vale on a Wednesday in May, in the office of the county clerk in Black Hollow, with two witnesses who were strangers and a ceremony that lasted less than 10 minutes and involved no flowers or music or any of the things that weddings were supposed to involve. She wore her traveling coat, the one Ada had hemmed. Rowan wore his good shirt, which was a version of his regular shirt that had been washed more recently. Cade drove them down in the wagon and waited outside with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the careful blankness of someone who has decided to be fine with something and is mostly succeeding. When they came back out, he looked at his father, then at Evelyn, then at the road ahead, and started the horses moving without comment. On the way back up the mountain, he said to no one in particular, "The fence in the south pasture is worse than Dawes said. Going to need a full day." "Then we'll give it a full day," Evelyn said. "George is going to complain about it," Cade said. "George complains about everything," Evelyn said. "He still does it." Cade made a sound that was not quite a laugh. The horses pulled them up the mountain road. The town fell away below. The summer that followed was the hardest work Evelyn had ever done in her life, which was a considerable statement given what the previous 8 months had contained. The pasture fence, the repair of the north cabin wall, the replanting of the kitchen garden that had been abandoned for 3 years, the curing of the season's first significant pelt haul, the endless procurement and preservation of food against the winter that was always coming no matter what season you were currently in, all of it ran simultaneously, with 5 children at various stages of being useful, and one large, capable man who worked like a machine but required occasional human maintenance in the form of being told directly what was needed rather than expected to intuit it. She told him directly. He responded. It worked. It wasn't simple. Nothing about it was simple. There were days when the workload was genuinely staggering, and she moved through it with the grim, focused momentum of someone who doesn't have the option of stopping. And there were evenings when she sat by the fire, too tired to mend the sock she'd picked up, and just held it uselessly until she remembered she was supposed to be doing something. There were conversations with Cade that went sideways and required repair, and days when Ada went quiet in a way that meant she was grieving her mother and needed space rather than presence, and moments when Maisie's cheerful, relentless affection was the only warm thing in a cold day. There were also nights when Rowan came home late and she'd left the pot by the fire and he'd eat and then sit across from her in the lamplight without needing to fill the air between them, and she'd mend or read or work through the food calculations for the following month. And the silence they occupied together had a quality she'd never had access to before. Not the silence of loneliness or avoidance, but the silence of two people who have agreed without words that they are comfortable in each other's presence. She had not known that kind of silence existed. She had not known she was missing it. In August, a letter came up the mountain with the supply rider who made quarterly runs to the outlying properties. It was addressed to Evelyn Vale, which was still a name she had a fraction of a second's adjustment to every time she encountered it. She opened it at the table while Maisie sat beside her practicing the letters Evelyn had been teaching her, and she read it through once and then set it down. "What is it?" Cade said from across the room. She looked at it. "My father," she said. "He's leaving Black Hollow. Going west, he says. He wanted me to know." The room was quiet. "Are you—" Ada started, then stopped, apparently unsure what she was asking. "I'm fine," Evelyn said. She considered the letter. The handwriting was shaky and the sentences were short, the way her father's communication had always been, abbreviated, leaving out the most important things, filling the spaces with whatever was easier. He hadn't apologized. She hadn't expected him to. There was a line near the end. "I hope you found it satisfactory up there." The same word Ed Mayer had used, satisfactory. She folded the letter. She thought about what she would have felt reading this letter in October. The complex, ugly tangle of it. The grief for the father he'd never quite been. The anger at what he'd done. The complicated love that persists in children for parents who have not earned it, that hangs on past sense or reason. She checked for all of that now, methodically. She found something quieter than she'd expected. Not nothing. She wasn't the kind of person who felt nothing, and she didn't want to be. But it had the quality of an old injury that had healed to a scar, present, occasionally noticeable, no longer the open thing it had been. "Good luck to him," she said, and meant it. Not warmly, but honestly. She put the letter in the fire. Maisie watched the letter burn with the solemnity she brought to all things. Then she looked at Evelyn. "Who was it from?" she asked. "Someone I used to know," Evelyn said. Maisie accepted this with her usual judicial nod and went back to her letters. September came, and with it the first smell of the winter turning in the air above the high ridges. Evelyn had been cataloging the signs since August. The way the light changed, the behavior of the animals on the lower slopes, the particular quality of the morning cold that said something different from summer cold. She'd learned to read it the way she'd learned everything else about this mountain, paying attention, trusting the evidence, not dismissing the small things. She sat down with Rowan in the first week of September and went through the food calculations for the coming winter. They sat across from each other at the table where they'd had their first real conversation. About the stores, about what was short, about surviving the winter. The same table, different people sitting at it now, or the same people made different by what had accumulated between October and September. The numbers were better than last year, not comfortable. Comfortable would require a different kind of life in a different kind of place. But solid. Sufficient. She'd spent the summer building margins, small ones, in every direction she could reach. "We're going to be all right," she said. Rowan looked at the paper, then at her. "You're sure?" "Barring catastrophe," she said, "which I can't promise, but the calculation is sound." "It always is," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her the way he looked at the ridge sometimes, not admiring it exactly, because that wasn't the right word for the relationship between a person and a thing they know deeply and have staked their life against. More like recognizing it, acknowledging what it is. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right. When I made the arrangement, when I came down the mountain and I made the arrangement with your father, I was doing it for the household, the practical thing. That was all I had in me at the time." He paused. "I want you to know that." "I know," she said. "What I don't want," he said, "what I don't want is for you to not know that it became real. Whatever this is, it's real. For me." She looked at him across the table for a moment. "Rowan," she said. "I know." "You know," he said, slightly skeptical. "You left salve for my hands in November," she said. "You've woken up before me every night this summer to check the fire so I don't have to. You told the entire town of Black Hollow, in front of witnesses, where I stand in this household. You're not a subtle man, but you're consistent." She held his gaze. "I know." Something shifted in his face. The last of whatever he'd been carrying into this conversation set down. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. The night before the first real frost of autumn, Evelyn stood outside the cabin in the dark. It was late. The children were asleep. Rowan was asleep. The mountain was doing what the mountain always did in the dark, which was simply to be enormous and indifferent and present. The sky above the ridge was clear, the stars very bright and very cold at this elevation, scattered in patterns she'd been slowly learning to name across the year. She stood there in her coat, Ada's hemmed coat, more worn now, broken in, and she looked up at the ridge and she thought, with the clarity that comes from genuine tiredness and genuine satisfaction existing in the same body at the same time, about what had actually happened here. She had come to this place as property, traded like a debt, loaded into a wagon, delivered to a life she hadn't chosen. That was the fact of where it had started, and she wasn't going to prettify it into something better than it was, because she'd spent enough of her life having things prettified into something better than they were, and she knew what that cost. But the thing about not having a choice about where you start is that it turns out to be entirely separate from whether you have a choice about what you do once you're there. That was what she'd learned, up here, in the cold and the difficulty and the relentless practical demands of surviving a place that didn't particularly care if you survived. You could be put somewhere without choosing it and still choose everything that came after. You could be sold and still become, through sheer insistence, something nobody owned. She thought about the girl her mother had raised, the girl who had learned to read and count and cook and mend and to look at a problem without flinching, who had kept a household running through poverty and illness, and a father who wasn't there in the ways that mattered. That girl had been quietly building towards something her whole life without knowing what it was or where it would happen. It had happened here, on this mountain, in this filthy, freezing, beautiful, difficult place that had stripped everything unnecessary off her and left only what was real. She wasn't a queen. She didn't think in those terms and wouldn't have used the word for herself. She was a woman who had come to a mountain with nothing and built a life on it through work and stubbornness and the refusal to be less than what she was capable of being. She was Evelyn Vale. She ran the household on Bitterroot Ridge. She had a husband who wasn't easy but was honest, and 5 children who weren't hers by blood, but were hers by everything that actually counted. And a mountain that had tried to kill her through cold and hunger, and a sick child in the night and had failed every time. Not because she was exceptional, but because she was relentless. And relentless was enough. The frost would come tomorrow. The winter would come after. The work would continue, indefinitely, without apology or break, because that was the nature of where they were. She pulled her coat tighter and looked at the stars over the ridge one more time. Then she went inside, where the fire was burning and the people she'd made her own were sleeping, and she closed the door on the cold. She was home. She had built it herself. And nobody, not a debt, not a father, not a town that had watched her leave with cruelty in their eyes, was ever going to take that from her. The mountain had tested everything she was and found her sufficient. That was enough. That had always been enough.